There are very few names in the coffee grinder biz that carry as much history and experience as Mazzer. But oftentimes when you picture a Mazzer, it's a tall hopper-based espresso grinder sitting beside a machine in a cafe. But today we're talking about their newest, and in my personal opinion, their most adventurous grinder yet. And it's taking a big leap into the highly competitive and massively growing 64mm flat burr home market. The Philos, which depending on where you look, can mean a few things. Friendship and love, but today we're less concerned with definitions and translations and more about how it performs, and if it lives up to the expectations created by its lengthy laundry list of highly attractive features, like its overall build quality and materials, optimized workflow, zero retention, effortless maintenance, modular grind adjustment, and of course, consistent grinds and delicious coffee. So in today's video, we're going to dig into everything and anything Mazzer Philos and see if this hotly anticipated $1,000 addition to the high-end single-dose market can hold its own. But first, in the spirit of full disclosure, the folks over at Mazzer sent me both the silver prototype you saw in the unboxing and this black production model for review, but of course agreed to my terms of no access to the contents of my draft or this video prior to full public release. But with all that out of the way, we're going to dive right into it after a quick word from this video's sponsor, Standart magazine, who is actually celebrating their 10th year of serving the global coffee community. So a happy birthday to Standart magazine. If you're into coffee, its culture, and learning about the world around it, Standart magazine is the perfect addition to your brew bar or coffee table. With quarterly releases, they shed light on issues both inside and outside of the cafe, highlighting people who elevate the industry, and deep dives into new ideas around all things coffee. To sweeten the deal, each issue also includes a sample of coffee from some of the world's best roasters, to give you the full sensory experience. You really can't beat the combination of fresh coffee and fresh print. So head on over to standartmag.com/Sprometheus, use the link in the description or code Sprometheus at checkout to snag $5 off your very own subscription of coffee and culture, shipped direct to your door nearly anywhere in the world with a money-back guarantee. And if you're still on the fence, you can actually snag Standart today for just the cost of shipping. There's not a whole lot to lose, and a whole lot to gain. Straight off the bat, let's just be real. Everyone's going to have their own opinions about the way this grinder looks, so let's just cut to the chase and talk about its build and materials. Now, the overall weight of the grinder is just shy of 30 pounds, and it definitely isn't what I would call dainty, which is why I find it odd that in their marketing, Mazzer even mentions its small footprint, but I would say that it's on the medium to heavier side of the home grinder spectrum. And along with the weight, the build of the grinder feels like a tank. Nothing feels loose or cheap, and overall you'll be hard-pressed to find much plastic, and it's made almost entirely of stainless steel, brass, and anodized aluminum. And the chamber itself is housed by an impressive amount of material, which is likely why many of the comments in the unboxing video were expecting a much larger burr set, based on the perceived amount of real estate inside the grinder. So currently the only issue I've really encountered when it comes to the build of the grinder itself is when it arrived, it had a bit of an odd sway and vibration because the feet weren't sitting flat on the counter. But Mazzer was quick to develop a new base with adjustable feet, which from what I understand will be on upcoming production models. Considering the fact that Mazzer has been sitting pretty firmly in the hopper-based grinder platform world for some time, I wasn't really sure how a single-dose grinder from Mazzer would perform, but I am pleased to say that the Philos is mostly thoughtfully laid out and is second nature and pretty easy to use. And if you're wondering about the mostly comment, that's essentially because the grind adjustment dial is in a somewhat odd location, sitting on the back end of the grinder, meaning you've got to look over the grinder itself and reach behind it to make adjustments. And this layout is somewhat unusual for grinders in general, and I could see it being an issue for our short-statured kings, queens, and emperors. But on the bright side, the grinder can be set for either 6-micron steps or stepless adjustments, by simply removing a few small screws under the rear cap. In terms of power, it's no slouch. Its 400-watt motor is plenty torquey enough to rip through beans in a cold start, so much so that you can even place about 25 grams of beans inside the chamber while still being able to close the slide and grind it out without a stall or a falter. But it does seem to be designed with hot starts in mind, using the 60-gram hopper and the slide to drop beans in once the grinder is running. From there, the beans enter the chamber where they first meet the auger or pre-breaker, which, according to Mazzer, breaks and feeds them into the burrs at a consistent rate, which is something we'll talk more about in depth in the next section. And as you'd expect, the coffee is then ground and exits out the bottom of the chamber into the stainless steel dosing cup. The cup itself fits loosely in a 58mm portafilter, and I find it easier to use a collar and pour them into a portafilter as opposed to the full flip. And the cup itself is held in place with some strong magnets, so it's not really going anywhere unless you want it to. When it comes to grinds retention, the Philos lands in the single-dose industry standard around 0.1 grams without RDT, and as close to zero as my scale can show when you use a little spritz of water. But the built-in knocker is an effective equalizer between the two methods, which is simply designed using spring tension to break free any static or superfines still stuck near the exit or in the dosing chute. And strangely or uniquely, you pick, the Philos also has this little tool that you can store behind the faceplate. It's called the shot finisher, and it's designed to be inserted into the chute from below and can help remove any retained grinds inside. But honestly, its usability is kind of awkward, so I only find myself really using it when I'm switching between coffees and want to avoid any unwanted flavor contamination. And when it comes to maintenance, which I guess in this case is cleaning, getting inside the grinder is tool-free. Just pop off the magnetic faceplate, loosen the butterfly screws, and the whole front portion of the grinder slides off. This gives you complete access to cleaning the grind chamber and both the static and spinning burr. But considering how nicely and precisely the Philos is machined, I wish this portion would slip on a little more effortlessly. But because there is some play in the fitment, it can be a bit of a pain to find the point where it slips on. Alright, now let's get into the main event, grinding and brewing. So first things first, let's talk about the auger and/or pre-breaker, since that's sort of where the whole grinding adventure begins. Now, the terms pre-breaker and auger are used interchangeably by Mazzer in their marketing because it's aimed at doing two things at once: pre-break the beans and then feed those broken beans into the burrs at a consistent rate, which is considered helpful in avoiding clogging, regrinding, as well as a more uniform particle distribution. Now, this is where I would usually talk about the rate of broken beans that come out of the grinder when there are no burrs installed, but with the Philos, it's a little trickier, because the exit is essentially blocked by a declumper of sorts, which only allows small bits through, so it's kind of hard to give you a scientific breakdown like I did on the DF83V. But it does appear to break most if not all the beans that come through in a reasonable amount of time. Though who's to say how much is broken by the pre-breaker and how much is pulverized through the exit by the burr carrier. But because it's all spinning at 1600 RPM, and it's even aggressive enough to popcorn bean shards out of the hopper when the slide is open, it's fair to say it definitely pre-breaks. And considering the relatively high speed of the Philos' burrs, it does have a pretty fast grind time, putting out about 1.3 grams per second on espresso and 3.3 grams per second on filter. And in terms of sound, the motor alone sits at a pretty quiet 55 decibels, and during grinding, it peaks around the average in the mid to high 70s. Of course, all the data and numbers we've discussed prior to this point in the video are the same between the two factory available burr sets, but let's start to talk about where things diverge based on your chosen cutting utensils. And I think the particle distribution is a good place to start, because that sort of gives you a general idea on where the flavor profiles will go. And I'd say this data is about as straightforward as I'd hoped. As you can see, right off the bat, the i189D hits 60% in the fine range, while the i200D lands at about 67%. But where you really can see the difference is in the breakdown chart of their micron sizes. The i200D burrs have the entirety of its particle distribution pushed over to one side, landing at a standard variation of 167.6. And as we look over and compare the i89D burrs, you can see that their distribution is much wider, with a standard variation of 494.5, keeping in mind that the lower number is the more uniform sample. And along with that, the flavor profiles from these burrs seem to corroborate the data, with the I200D unimodal burrs producing a more clarity-focused brew, since the more consistent particles extract at a similar rate. So coffees from those burrs have a more modern third-wave flavor profile, essentially elevating those nuanced fruity and floral flavors, acidity, and a juicy mouthfeel. So those looking to really push their extractions to maybe longer ratios, lighter roasts, or even focus on filter coffee may find these burrs hit just right. And the I189D burrs, with their classic bimodal cutting geometry, produces a wider range of particle sizes, which develops a more traditional flavor profile, leaning towards balance, complexity, and texture in both espresso and filter form. So for those looking to brew mainly espresso in the medium to dark roast range, on the classic 1:1 to 1:3 ratios, you would likely find yourself right at home with these. And conveniently, the burr alignment appears to stay pretty tight when switching burr sets, even those not designed by Mazzer. Though you should expect to have to change the 0 point on the rear dial when you swap burrs, as I found the 189D chirping at around 20 notches off 0 and my SSP MPs around 95 when the 0 is set for the I200D. Alright, final thoughts. And I think that the Mazzer Philos on the whole is a great addition to the home light commercial single dose market. For one, it does everything it advertises and does them well, and there isn't any massive glaring issues or things that leave me sort of scratching my head in confusion. I mean, even the grind adjustments being on the back of the grinder does make sense in terms of not losing your dial in when opening or cleaning, and keeping grinds out of the dial mechanism itself, which allows for smooth usability. So it's sort of a small price to pay when it comes to workflow. But of course, there are some features that seem to be missing, at least in the current grinder market, and that is anti-static, blind burrs, RPM control, etc., which are definitely things I asked about in my early communications with Mazzer, and their reasoning for why they didn't include those things landed on a few points. One of which being, they started developing this grinder back in 2020, and back in that time, those sort of features were few and far between. They were very rare, if not basically unavailable. So as things sort of opened back up after COVID, and those sort of features were now popular and popping up in grinders more often, they thought, well, maybe we could add it, but it would just result in more R&D, more time in development, and add possible failure points. And if you're familiar with Mazzer and their tank-like reliability and reputation, I can understand why they wouldn't want to make their first home-focused grinder more of a liability than it has to be, especially because home baristas are far harsher critics than cafe owners. And honestly, sticking with overall simplicity is a smart play for Mazzer, which makes for a grinder that's hard to fault beyond a few small annoyances. Plus, when you consider the grinder as a whole, and the fact that it has a lot of market ideals, like the materials and the burrs and the grind consistency, its $1,000 price point puts it in a uniquely competitive place between the more budget-friendly DF line of grinders and something like the Zerno that's more expensive, but sort of similar. But on that note, I think it's time I start wrapping this one up, and as always, pass the conversation on to you. So what are your thoughts on the Mazzer Philos? Love it, hate it, indifferent? Is there features on it you love, features you wish it had, like the ones we discussed earlier? And of course, what are your thoughts on the look? Because I think that's going to be the most divisive piece of this grinder. So drop your answers to those questions and any others you may have in the comment section down below. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that little bell button for notifications when new videos drop. Check out my Instagram @Sprometheus for more coffee content. Help support the channel by considering becoming a member for unique exclusive perks. And as always, stay caffeinated. Ponyboy